The Chroma 2 case was released in April of 2015, 3 months after the first case was. The update it was introduced in was a bit boring. Nothing to open the fridge about, but it did fix the radar name for long A on dust too. The Chroma 2 case requires the Chroma 2 key to open, and features the same 6 exclusive knife finishes as the first and third case in this collection. I don't think there's much more to say about it than that. Let's move on to the skins. We start with the Negev Man-o by Arbitron. There's an earlier sawed-off submission on the workshop, but he considers the Negev to be where the design started to come alive, and he appreciates it for that. It has more general wear than those that followed, the AWP being one such later design, even though it was accepted before the Negev in the Chroma 1 case. The sawed-off Origami by Big Monkey and Thurnip is the second weapon from the Origami collection, with the first being a P250 design. It's based on origami folds and shapes, and indeed he used paper to design the weapon finishes. I got Deus Ex vibes from this design, but the colour palette varies per gun, with light blue making an appearance in most of the submissions. The MP7 Armor Core by Ezekiel was the first series that he designed, back in his last year at school. He started with the Deagle, with the goal of making it realistic and corporate, but also flashy. To achieve this, he went for a combination of brushed steel and black and white shapes. The steel texture had already been made during his time using GIMP, but the rest was done in Photoshop. It was originally named the Ultra Modern, but Valve changed it to Armor Core, a name that Ezekiel says has grown on him. The P250 Valence by Ceridium was inspired by topological maps. He particularly liked maps of rural areas and the way that they used multiple flowing lines to represent mountains and other three-dimensional landmasses. He enjoys using line thickness to help describe form when designing, and based this skin series around that idea. He wanted for them to have a metallic, anodized feel, and for each weapon in the series to have its own unique colour palette. The Famas, for example, is red, orange and grey themed. This series was originally named Contour, but he's pleased that Valve changed the name as he feels it now rolls off the tongue more easily. The Desert Eagle Bronze Deco was originally called the Sparkling Bronze by its maker, Nanu, who also achieved success with the MAG7 Malachite in the first Chroma case. This Deagle uses the anodized multicoloured finish to give a striking, shiny appearance with a number of different metallic textures. The AK-47 Elite build by Mind was originally called Mastery, which is important to note since it still shows Master Collection on the gun. He made the series back in the workshop's infancy and believes it was quite unique at the time to try adding fake details onto them like holes, screws, ventilations, and so on. Obviously it isn't anymore, but we're talking 2014-15 here. He's happy with how it turned out, saying it looks badass but with an air of quality without being too over the top with its colour scheme. He used gold in its design but didn't use it excessively. He provided me with some really interesting behind the scenes pictures of this model. It's one of the most widely used blue skins, but Mind always wonders what it could have been had it been red or pink instead, as he was a little surprised and disappointed when it was made to be military spec. The UMP-45 Grand Prix by KF Hammond was inspired by watching Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, which starts with the 1908 Grand Prix. He loves the simple colours and designs in the paint jobs of old cars, and set out to mimic the beat-up vintage look. He did this by adjusting the wear so that they can't be factory new, as he sees the scratches as being part of the design. The UMP-45 was chosen as it has nice large flat surfaces to show the roundel on. He said the P90 was good for this as well. When the design was accepted, he thought that Valve had made a mistake, as it had been a year since he made it. He took great fascination in looking around to see where it was used, and was happiest when he saw a pro player using it in a professional championship match on Twitch. He thinks that his submission gives hope to other workshop creators who aren't capable of making real fancy art like the Hyper Beast. As you might have guessed, Hammond really likes cars, and hopes to add to his collection once he gets more garage space. Oh, and if these renderings look realistic, that's because they are. He made a model of the weapon in real life to give to Valve as a present, though sadly they have a no presents policy. Look at what you're missing out on, Valve. The idea behind the CZ75 pole position by Ceridium was really the idea of making the cut, with professionals working tirelessly to improve their skills to be the best at what they do. In Counter-Strike that might consist of aim, movement, strategy and so on. So this skin was developed around the idea of somebody trying to transition from amateur to pro. The checkered flags, flowing lines, cut lines, guideline marks, etc. were all used to get across the idea of precision, winning and ultimately making the cut. The MAG7 Heat by Dupe is a later version of the Heat design, first seen with his MAC-10. He was very happy that Valve included it a second time, as he really thinks he was able to build on and to improve the design since the first one. The hardest bit of the project was the red shading around the heat lines, as once the model was unwrapped it was very difficult to tell which bits of the weapon it represented and which bits should have been semi-hot. It took a lot of switching between 2D and 3D before it was done. As a little Easter egg, the magazines dropped by these weapons are also hot looking. He tried this with the R8 as well, but unfortunately the rounds from these cannot be textured. He'd like to give a special shout out to his artwork team, Inhumane and Joe Salad, and he'd also like to thank Algis for helping him to cope with the workshop and the feedback he received, which wasn't always kind. The AWP Worm God by Enzyme was originally called Twine, as he initially intended for it to look more like rose twine, but leaving out the thorns and flowers gave it a strange brain matter look that he liked, so he left it. The spiral on the skull comes from an earlier snail shell idea, but it wasn't visible due to the AWP's body shape, so he left the skull as it was. The skin was originally more vivid in colour, featuring a blood red palette and textured scope and barrel, but he toned it down from feedback from a friend. This was also solved by switching to the more metallic patina style, which also meant that some parts of the weapon couldn't be customised, and that all wear levels looked very similar. This skin required some changes for the Chinese version of the game. He was scared white would still look too much like a skull, so he changed the design to green, just to be safe. He's happy that the Worm God is a cheap skin that lots of people can afford, and is always happy to see it being used. This is the Famas Djinn by Gaunt. The engraved artwork on this design is representative of the Djinn, a mysterious diabolic race of tricksters and manipulators, born of living smokeless flame in pre-Islamic Arabian mythology. This design features a polymer casing that's accompanied by heat-treated steel inlays with gilded edge pinstriping, all under a delicious heavy transparent lacquer, and many of the original components have been replaced with a steel alloy, polished to perfection by the patina weapon finish. The Galil Eco by Love Croissant has an interesting story behind it. He started with the colours before finding the double meaning, since eco can mean both economic and ecological. He chose weapons that you'd typically only find on eco rounds. However, this limited his choices to just pistols, and he didn't really consider weapons like the Deagle fitting for the design, so instead chose weapons like the Galil that you only really find because the owners didn't have enough money for a proper AK. He decorated the design with a fake corporation by the name of Eco Industries. The barcode is intended to look mass-produced and industrialised, and on this design happens to also be the bomb code. He considers this skin quite ironic, since the contrast between the two different ecos is quite extreme. The 5.7 Monkey Business is also by Love Croissant, and the story behind this one is also amusing. He thought of the idea of having a banana for a gun, but then he was all like, nah, it must be done already. But then he browsed the workshop and was all like, oh, it hasn't been done yet. So he made it himself to fill such a glaring hole in the market. It only took a few hours to make, and he was very surprised when it was accepted. He considers it a silly idea, but it's not his fault that nobody else thought it up first. The MAG-10 Neon Rider by Puffin is a beautiful hand-painted skin, the first he has done for the MAG-10. It looks like something straight out of Far Cry 3 Blood Dragon or anything else vividly 80s in style. There's a running story with these designs, first with this MAG-10, next with the M4A4, and the latest being the P90. Over on Red Moon Workshop's YouTube channel, they even have their own YouTube videos, which continue on with a classic 80s style and are definitely worth a watch. Check them out by clicking on this fantastic annotation feature. I'm so happy that YouTube allows for stuff like this, and I hope that Puffin gets better soon. And lastly is the M4A1S Hyper Beast by Renegade, though we'd like to make it clear that the art was done by Brock Hofer and that Renegade's job was in adapting it for CSGO. He was first inspired to make things for the workshop after seeing what Ceridium had managed to do. Sadly, Renegade's workshop career started with a few snags, as following the Huntsman case debacle, his USPS Orion collaboration was all but removed from the game. Fortunately, he found success again with the Hyper Beast, which has now been custom changed to fit several weapon skins, with this M4 being one such example. The design has even made its way to mousepads, hoodies and NZXT cases. He says that having this accepted into the game has changed his life, and he is very grateful for Valve for what they've done for the community.